Aart, may I ask you why a book on social background and the demographic life course?
Well, when I started thinking about this for an ERC project on which this book was based about 10 years ago, demography, and I think in particular European demography, had a strong individualized tendency. You could say that a kind of individual choice paradigm was dominant in the field. And I think that's most clearly visible in the second demographic transition literature, where the focus is on how individual choice is guided by changing values and attitudes. And if European demographers were giving attention to inequalities and to constraints on demographic choice, it had, and I think still has, a focus on education. For instance, there's a lot of research on educational differences in fertility. And I think this research is really important. But by just focusing on people's educational credentials, you have a focus on what sociologists call achieved status, the position that people themselves achieved by, for instance, their education. But that kind of status is, of course, highly dependent on your social background, on what sociologists called ascribed status, the kind of status you can't help having. And European demographers have not paid much attention to ascribed status in demographic decimation. And that is something that I felt was weird, in particular because at the time, 10 years ago, the interest in social inequality was increasing rapidly across the social sciences. Just think about the work of Thomas Piketty. So that was the reason that I focused on the link between social background and the demographic life course. And you could say that the book more or less argued for unequal choice rather than an individual choice paradigm. And that unequal choice focuses on individual and structural constraints on demographic choices. So that's why the book came into being.
That's very interesting. And may I ask you, what do you mean exactly by social background?
Well, it's generally about the conditions on which you have been raised. So you can think of conditions in the parental home, but you could also think of conditions in the neighborhoods that you grew up in. In the book, the focus is in particular on the socio-economic position of parents, so their education and their job status, and on the living arrangements in which you have been raised. And that's in particular whether you have been raised by both biological parents or not.
Okay. May I ask if you like what is really new on that? Don't you know a lot about that already? What is the new element in the book?
Yes, you're absolutely right. We do know a lot about the topic. What we do know less about, I think, is because all this research generally has been done within specific country contexts. We know very little about whether the consequences of your social background for your demographic choices, whether this varies across countries. And basically that's the central story of the book. It has this comparative status. And the general hypothesis is that we test that the consequences of social disadvantage in youth for demographic choices in adulthood varies across countries. And in particular, that social background is less important for the demographic choices that young adults make in societies that offer good opportunities for young adults to escape from situations of deprivation. So it's about welfare states offering support to young adults, and it's about cultural climates that allow you to express yourself. So to me, that is the core aim of the Context of Opportunities project, and thus the central question of the book. And I think that's what's new about it.
That's great, and it makes lots of sense. So may I ask now, Francesco? Francesco, what is your assessment about the state of affairs in the field of demography as far as the interest for social inequality is concerned?
Thank you. I believe there's been a convergence in the last couple of decades between the demography and Lifecourse research and the study of social inequality and social stratification. This kind of convergence story has two sides. First of all, as you can read beautifully in this book, it is impossible to ignore social inequality, and in particular social background inequalities, when we want to study demographic choices, especially when we emphasize the word choice, as Aart was referring to. So demography cannot do it without considering inequality. The other side is that demographic choices generate inequality. That is true within one's life, within a generation, but also for the following generation. So basically, you cannot do a study of social stratification and inequality ignoring demography any longer, and you cannot do demography ignoring social inequality and stratification any longer.
Thank you. May I ask our participants here, if you have questions, you can already type them in the Q&A, because at the end of this session, we are going to open, we'll have a Q&A session. So feel free to type in your questions if you have any. So now I'm curious about how was the process of writing this book. Mioara, may I ask you, what was it like to work on this project? What has been your strategy to produce the book on cross-national research? And can you tell us a bit more about the background process?
Yes, I guess we were working on the book somehow before officially deciding that we are going to edit such a book. I think it was somewhere in the back of my mind, that we were going to do that. And as the context of Opportunities project was developing and different studies have been published, we realized that each of the studies conducted are by themselves groundbreaking, but that their potential can only be fully enhanced if we provide this sort of bigger integrated picture. So this was a bit our starting point for several chapters. So at that time, we asked the members of our team to write topics on the specific topics they had expertise on. And for these chapters, we sort of focused on discussions of theoretical mechanisms and empirical testing. Well, throughout the project, we also had many challenges, and a lot of them methodological and analytical challenges. So, well, we had quite some sweat that was released on these topics. And yeah, at that time, we were working a lot also with all kind of researchers in our network to sort of try to solve these issues. And then we also realized that actually a lot of researchers around the world were struggling a bit with the same issues. So then we thought it would actually be of great value for the research community if we can share the struggles we had, but also our solutions, how we solved all these issues, and maybe help the research community to struggle less in the future. But yeah, looking back to the entire process, I think it took about 2 years from the moment we decided that we are going to publish the book until the moment we really published it. And the process itself was very smooth because those were people with whom we were working within the Vono project. Well, we knew what to expect from them, how to work together. So that was somehow easy for us. So yeah.
And I guess you have a little surprise for our audience. Would you like to share your video?
Yes, I will share my screen now. Well, what we did, just to introduce it to the people, this book clearly wouldn't have been possible without the contribution of many authors, and we just made a short video with all the authors introducing the chapters they wrote. Well, yes, let me know if it's visible for everybody.
In this introductory chapter, we argue that the theoretical discussion in demography is shifting from a narrative emphasizing individual choice to a narrative focusing on social inequality. We outline how this book studies social inequality in the demographic life course from a comparative perspective.
This chapter focuses on the link between parental socioeconomic status and union formation and dissolution. Young adults from high-status families enter their residential union at a later age and have a higher risk to dissolve this union compared to young adults from low-status families. However, the strength of this link between parental status and union formation and dissolution varies across countries due to cultural, institutional, and economic country differences. In this chapter, I examine to what extent the effect of parent SES on partner status at first birth is mediated through home SES. I examine this in 16 North American and European countries. The results suggest that in many countries, next to the intergenerational transmission of SES, parental SES also plays a very important role in explaining partner status at first birth.
Chapter focuses on the linkages between socioeconomic background, family formation, and economic disadvantage. Results show that while family formation patterns has changed, the influence of socioeconomic background has persisted over time. This chapter also shows that family background continues to have some impact in young adulthood in terms of union formation patterns and income trajectories.
This chapter focuses on adult family-related experiences and the manner in which they affect later life well-being outcomes such as loneliness, employment, and earnings. Next to revealing cross-national variation in these relationships, this chapter also explains how these differences depend on cultural norms and values regarding family-related behavior or the economic circumstances and opportunities available. This methodological chapter introduces a new method of analysis for nested data structures with 2 levels and a small level 2 sample size. This is a situation often encountered in cross-national research. The 2-step meta-analytical approach presented allows the testing of hypotheses similar to the ones tested by multi-level modeling, but provides reliable conclusions even when few countries are analyzed.
In Chapter 7, we propose the hidden Markov models as one of the main building blocks of Lifecourse generating models, and then discussed a few applications of these models in the domain of family formation, school-to-work transition, and its interactions.
In this chapter, I discussed the social mechanisms explaining how demographic behavior is transmitted from one generation to the next. I argue in favor of widening the theoretical perspective. This will enable us to understand how the family of origin shapes the life courses of young adults and how the country context moderates the reproduction of social inequalities within families.
In this final chapter, I discuss what we have learned from the Conno project and what our results imply for our understanding of the demographic life course. This life course is strongly stratified by social background, but the role of social background varies across countries. Social background matters least in countries where the options for individual expression are optimal.
Thank you so much for sharing this very, very interesting video where I could learn a lot about the chapters. Very, very well done. I have a question to you about, after listening to the chapters and the contributions of each team, you must have had lots of thoughts about how to approach a comparative analysis. So I'm curious about which kind of data methodology did you use in the book?
Well, yeah, throughout the project, we had quite some challenges. So, well, we don't have that much time because the list can be long, but let me try to think of a couple to mention. And of course, one of them was the choice of data sets. A common approach in current books is to provide different chapters analyzing different national data sets. And with such an approach, comparative conclusions are based on data from different analyses and data who have not necessarily been collected for comparative purposes. As this book, exactly the similarities and differences across countries had central, we chose to focus on data sets with information that has been harmonized across countries. So we use data sets that allow comparability in terms of measurement instruments such as the European Social Survey or the Survey of Health and Retirement, the known share, but especially we based analysis on the Generations and Gender program. The GGP had particular value for us as it integrated large national samples with good indicators for childhood disadvantage, rich information on the demographic life course, and later life outcomes. But even with this great data sets, another challenge for us was to ensure high quality data for many countries. In some studies, we were able to ensure this higher number of countries by combining data sets. So for example, we were able to combine GGP and share. But in most situations, such expansions were not possible, as often we didn't want to give up on the quality of certain central measures for us. But well, having a small sample of countries to analyze challenged us in terms of analysis techniques to use. So the most common way, for example, to analyze individuals nested in countries is by means of multi-level models. That's known in the research community. However, the multi-level analysis is often questionable when the number of countries is low. And in our case, it was often around 15 countries, which is on the lower side. So, well, we were puzzling a lot with these issues and actually ended up developing sort of our own method of analysis, which is presented in this book, and is a method that allows the testing of hypotheses similar to the ones tested by multi-level modeling, but it provides reliable estimates. And just a short one last challenge to mention was the construction of good economic, cultural, and institutional country level indicators. The economic indicators were somehow easier to obtain, but we had a lot of issues in constructing the cultural indicators. And in particular, having measures that apply to older cohorts at national level, that was challenging. But well, of course, a lot more on the challenges and the solutions we provided can be found in the book.
Thank you so much, Mioara. Aart, may I ask you, okay, we learned now that there has been lots of choices you have to do regarding data to cover all the countries you wanted to cover, but you also covered a lot of demographic decisions during the life course. So what are the most important conclusions you have drawn from the project?
Thank you, Daniela. Well, let me try to summarize the results in just 3 points. First, we basically found that childhood disadvantage mattered for all the adult demographic outcomes that we studied. So if you compare those from a low socioeconomic background with those with their peers from a high socioeconomic background, those from a low socioeconomic background, they start partner relationships, both cohabitation and marriage at an earlier age. They're more likely to opt for cohabitation. They're more likely to have a child within cohabitation or a child outside a stable partner relationship. And if they conceive a child outside a stable relationship, they're less likely to convert that relationship into a union. But you could also say that the long arm of of childhood disadvantage reached even further into older adulthood, because we found that those from a disadvantaged background, they were more likely in older adulthood to be lonely, to be non-employed, to have low income. And if you think about older adulthood, you have to think about people about my age. So there's really a long arm of childhood disadvantage. So that's the first conclusion. The second one is that the relationship between childhood disadvantage and these adult outcomes, that they showed considerable variation across countries. Again, for almost all the indicators we looked at. So there was really strong evidence that context matters. And third, we found that some of the variation across context that we found could be linked to country level economic, cultural, and institutional factors. I think it's fair to say that this was the toughest part of the project for some of the reasons that Mioara already mentioned. But I think we found the strongest effects for cultural factors. And you could say that the relationship between social background and adult demographic choices generally was weaker in countries that are more advanced in terms of individualization and in terms of the spread of the second demographic transition. So countries where the culture focuses on individual self-expression, there we found that the long arm of childhood disadvantage was weakest. And the role of country level economic and institutional factors was less clear. I think that these are the main findings, I think, from the study.
Fascinating. Francesco, may I ask you, what's your view about this issue of cross-national difference? Do you think it's really possible to disentangle the role of economic, cultural, and institutional factors? I would like to hear your thoughts on that.
Thank you. That's one of the most important challenges, because the country of birth is possibly the most important determinant of our life chances, of our life course. So the book is showing examples also within advanced societies, but we know that at the global level. I think the approach that is being taken in the book, multi-level modeling, meta-regression, provides a way to disentangle these factors. On the other hand, it's harder to infer causal conclusions from this kind of models. While causal conclusions are hard or at times impossible to reach, what this approach based on meta-regression, multi-level modeling provides is strong, robust evidence of associations that is backed by theoretical reasoning. And I think that's the best we can do.
Thank you. May I ask you, how do you think we can make progress in this topic in the future?
Oh, okay. I think here the progress is linked to having more. I mean, it's easy to say more data, but in this case, it's really the thing. We lack big data infrastructures in the social sciences. Actually, there's only some of them. We need more data that are like the ones used in the book, comparable microdata across societies. So we need more survey and administrative data that are harmonized across societies. And we need more innovative data collections like the ones arising from digital footprints, from the traces we leave on the web, that are comparable across societies. And then we can apply the approach that has been described to make more progress and disentangling effects at the cross-national level.
Thank you so much. We're moving to the end of this session, and I don't want to finalize this conversation without asking to all of you to very briefly tell us what do you believe are the key challenges for the future regarding inequalities in the demographic life course. Mioara, you can start.
I can start. Yeah, I think I can link to what Francesco was saying, probably starting with getting better data. That would be one step. And once we can achieve that, I think for me, it would be good to have a complete view of important resources, both at the micro level and at the macro level, sort of prioritizing them so we can move forward into decreasing inequalities.
Thank you, Aart.
Wow, summarizing the key challenges in a very brief amount of time, that's in one sentence, that's really tough. Well, I would like to follow up on what has been said by Mioara and Francesco concerning data. I think data is essential. At the same time, I don't believe that our data for cross-national research is going to be so good that we are really going to be able to empirically disentangle whether it's culture, whether it's economics, whether it's institutional factors that matter or their interplay. I think we always need the combination of good data and sound empirical research with plausible theoretical ideas. And any explanation is only as good as your theoretical storyline is going to be. So it's the combination of theory and empirics that is, to me, the big challenge.
Thank you so much, Francesco.
I think the big challenge is to link this kind of research to policy, and in particular to be able to inform evidence-based policies. Sometimes the findings of a project like CONOP tell us that in order to change the situation and improve the life chances, we need to completely reform a system. I don't know, to change the institutional system at the school level. This is if you have a kind of country level key differences. I think this is a big challenge, and usually we are not so ready to take this kind of message, and we have to think seriously about the policy implication of this kind of work.
Thank you. So we are now moving to the Q&A. We don't have we're already 5 minutes on top of our what we plan to do, but we have 3 very nice questions here, and I'm reading them to you. The first one, I'm sorry, I cannot read your name in your, I guess your name is Ekaterina, but if you can write in the chat, it would be great. So she's saying, thank you very much for the marvelous book. My question concerns theories. Did you confirm the assumption of the second demographic transition and of the life course approach? Did you gain any unexpected results conflicting with these theories?
Okay, shall I try to provide an answer?
Sure.
Well, the goal was not that much to basically test the assumptions of these theories. I look at the social demographic transition theory, and I look at the Lifecourse theory more like a kind of perspective on an important topic like this. So the Lifecourse theory informs us that what happened earlier in your life can have an impact on what happens later. And I think that's generally true. I think the same, to some extent, is true for the the second demographic transition literature. It's really hard to try to test it and to falsify the theory because it's so broad. What I did not expect that much was that we really found that culture seemed to be the strongest empirical predictor of the strength of the relationship between social background and adult outcomes. And in a sense, that comes closest to the ideas that are central in the second demographic transition literature. And it suggests at least that in cultural settings where there's a lot of value given to self-expression, that there you as an individual person seem to be more in charge, and your family background seems to be less important than in less in cultures where less importance is given to self-expression. The problem, of course, that Francesco hinted at, that I hinted at earlier, is that these cultural systems usually are the same systems where there is general welfare support for young adults. So whether it's really culture, whether it's support, the interaction between the two that develop in a path-dependent way in society, that's often hard to see.
Exactly. We have a second question here from Mihail Gulsinki. I hope I pronounce your name decently. I apologize for that. Do you discuss also geographical factors like place of origin, urban-rural inequalities, local marriage markets, or other contextual variables?
I can try to answer this one. Well, those are, of course, very valid observation and very valid points that could have a place in such a research. Unfortunately, that was not the focus within our research. We were looking at the micro level and the macro level, and this sort of meso level factors, we didn't look into them. But I think, yeah, maybe for future research, they should be definitely taken into account. But I think, yeah, also in the research, we sort of should take it step by step and adding complexity, because in our research, it was already very complex. The settings were very complex, and the more complexity you add to all the research, the more problems you add. So there was actually no place for such aspects within our research.
Thank you. And then we have a final question by Regina Maroncelli, and she's from ELFAC, European Large Families, and she's asking, did you explore the point of view of large families and social background?
Well, that's an important issue. And to be frank, when I started with this project, I was so ambitious. And while working on the project and trying to solve challenges, you have to find out that sometimes you have to make choices. And for instance, with regard to fertility, we decided to focus on questions related to having a child outside of a stable relationship, and to what extent that is influenced by your social background. Given that we felt that's an element that is so important for the future adult life course of women, particularly women and sometimes men who have a child in that kind of situation. So with regard to fertility, we opted to choose having a child outside a stable relationship and to focus on that, rather than on how your social background influences the number of children you get and how this varies cross-nationally. I guess I have to try to write a second proposal to include that one. But thank you.
Thank you so much. I don't see more questions coming up. So I would like to thank you enormously for sharing your time and explaining so nicely all that is inside this brilliant book. I invite you all to really explore it. And I hope to see you all again in our next events. Aart, you would like to say some words?
I would like, well, yes. In closing, I would really like to thank Population Europe for hosting this session, and in particular you, for Daniela, for being a perfect interviewer. Thank you so much.
It's my pleasure. So, bye-bye.
Bye.